Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Wednesday afternoon coffee break. Today, we are actually be talking about a really timely topic, upcoming election issues with one of our municipal attorneys, Courtney Gabbara, who I'm happy to say is in my office here in the Southfield office. We have offices throughout the state, Lansing, Grand Rapids, and some other places, but she's a couple doors down from me, so I get to hear about all of this, especially coming up to election day. So we're going to be talking about election and some of the issues that municipalities, townships, pollsters, things like that may kind of see in a very abbreviated 30-minute session. So with that, I'd like to welcome Courtney for taking time out of her day to be here in this busy time. I'd like to thank all of you for attending, and let's get right into it here. So Courtney, obviously we have an election coming up. We
We
had some
do.
primaries a little bit ago, but we got a big one coming up in the very near future. So with that in mind, and kind of with the primaries behind us, the big election coming up, what are some of the best practices that electors and municipalities can take prior to November 5th, right? So we're not talking at the date of the election,
Right. Yeah.
between now and the election. What are some things that we can do to make sure things run smoothly and make sure that there's confidence in the process?
I really like that question. And I talked about it briefly the other week when I was interviewed by the Michigan Business Network. And I think it's so important to emphasize that elections right now are under such strict scrutiny. And the pressure is really on for clerks to make sure that they know election law in and out, really, right? They're the experts in this area. And so the best advice I can give is preparation, plan and prepare. And that is going to be well before election day. This is going to be months beforehand, and it's going to come down to training your election inspectors, making sure you're keeping up with appropriate deadlines. And a really big one that I think is really neglected until like you actually need them is training your law enforcement officers, right? Because they tend to play a big part in ensuring, success and safety on election day. So making them aware of some of the things to be on the lookout for. So planning and preparation, those to me are the keys to a successful election day. If you can train and train and train and get up, all your P's and Q's in order, you will probably troubleshoot at least 90% of any problems you can face on election day beforehand.
Sure. And so you mentioned two things I'd like to explore in a little more detail, right? Training and also police officers, right? It's something that, at least I've taken for granted at my polling location, right? It's usually a pretty benign polling location, not a lot of controversy going on, but certainly that is not universal. So when
Yeah.
when we first talk about training, right? So is there mandated training? Can you do more training? What are some of the practices that, you would advise municipalities to at least start considering between now and election day?
Yeah, I mean, and some of it comes down to resources and time, right? I mean, not every municipality is created equally, so they don't necessarily have the time and the resources that other bigger cities or townships might have. But there are minimum requirements from the state in terms of how many trainings an election inspector is supposed to undergo. It's usually just one, but there is nothing prohibiting a clerk from mandating more for their election inspectors, right? To make sure that they've really got things down pat. And making sure that they understand the process and enforcement procedures. For law enforcement, that's obviously different, right? The clerk doesn't have any say so over law enforcement, but they are teammates in this process to ensure success. They've got to work together. Most law enforcement officers don't deal with election issues on a regular basis. So when election day rolls around, they don't know what's necessarily a criminal offense under election law. That's not their norm. So having that sit down conversation in advance, knowing who's going to be on duty, that will probably take a lot of the strain off of your clerks and your election inspectors on the day of, because you'll know who to call if something escalates and an election inspector has to step away, and they'll know how to de-escalate the situation in accordance with Michigan election law.
Sure. So what it comes down to is with most things in life, good communication, right, between those
Absolutely,
two
absolutely.
agencies.
Yeah. Checks and
And
balances for yourself and then the planning and preparation.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, we sometimes take for granted, the interdepartmental communication, right?
Yeah.
As you say, knowing who's going to be on call, right? Knowing the point of contact, how information should flow, and then maybe just having a general training session that sounds like, a refresher course, right?
Mhm.
Look, I have friends in law enforcement, and much like the bar exam, right? You cram a
Mhm.
whole bunch of information into your head, and as soon as you take the bar exam,
Yeah, out the
90% of it
window.
goes out,
Yeah.
and you focus on what you do, right?
Mhm.
Your corporate attorney, your divorce attorney, right? You emphasize that area, right?
Mhm.
Election law comes around every few years, right? It's probably not top of the mind for many law enforcement officers, certainly not all of them, but having that refresher course would probably be a good use of time, it sounds like.
Yeah, yeah. I absolutely agree. I think it's essential. And then just in terms of for electors, if there are any electors joining us or who might be tuning in later, I would just say, be mindful of your inspectors and your clerks. If you have questions, their job is transparency. They are not hiding the ball from you. They want to ensure that you understand the processes and procedures just as well as their inspectors do. So ask questions, be mindful of certain things when you get to the polling place, listen, and kindness will get you far. So that's my little tip for electors when you head over to a polling place to cast your vote.
So let's transition from pre-election to election day, right? And look, every election cycle you hear some crazy stories, right?
Oh, yeah.
Again, I'm fortunate I'm in a pretty benign polling place, right? I don't get to see these, but you hear them on the news, right? Just folks canvassing at the polls, posting pictures of ballots, wearing shirts, wearing signs, things like that, right? And I think there's a lot of confusion as to what is and is not allowed, right? And look, I know that this is a very brief 30-minute
Yeah.
interview here. You can probably spend days talking about the intricacies of
Oh,
these
yeah.
laws, but can you kind of give us a general overview about some of the issues that you typically see on polling day, some of the answers to those issues, what can and cannot be done, and as I hear more things, maybe we'll dive in a little bit deeper into any particular item.
Okay, yeah. So I think the biggest thing, and I call this kind of the golden rule of election day, is that on election day, all voters have the right to exercise their right to vote in private with undue distractions or discomfort. That means no voter intimidation. That means no disruptions or harassment at the door, right? Everybody has the right to cast their vote the way that they want to without feeling uncomfortable or uneasy when they're walking through the doors. So there's a bunch of different checks and balances that the state came up with that are enforced through the election law to ensure that. So the big thing, right? Because this is more universal, the phones. We have phones at our fingertips. We're so used to taking pictures and
Right.
selfies and
Right.
texting and everything. I mean, how often do we not even realize our phones are in our hand? But when
Yeah.
you're walking into the polling place after you're checked in, that phone should probably go into your pocket, realistically, right? You are permitted by law to take a picture of your ballot, but you cannot take a picture of yourself with your ballot, just like you can't take a picture of the general polling place, because it could be considered voter intimidation, right? If you snap somebody taking or voting, or you get a glimpse of their ballot. So there's those kinds of regulations. You can't even show the picture of your ballot within that 100-foot radius of the polling place. So that's really interesting. Now there's different standards and criterias for like news anchors and reporters and things like that who want to get a couple of shots for their stories and things like that. But that's a whole different ball game, and there's different regulations for that.
Yeah.
Um, and then we can talk about canvassing and stuff if you want to, but
Yeah. Well, and without getting into into the depth of the canvassing, because I know that's an hour, 2 hour, 3 hour long
it can get
conversation,
pretty
right?
heavy. Yeah.
What about, just maybe what I like to think of as a layperson, right? The mini canvassing, right? Or the person that's carrying a sign, right? That last minute push to get votes, right? What are the rules and regulations, again, from a high level surrounding that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because, like you said, we're so passionate this time of year about our
Mhm.
candidates, and we want to take every last opportunity we have to, promote our perspective on the right way of voting for a candidate or a ballot question or what have you, right? But going back to that voter intimidation component, while we encourage you to canvass for your candidate or ballot question, you have to do so in a mindful and respectful manner for all the other electors who are just there to cast their ballot and head on home, right? Or head to work. And so the regulation is that you can't hand out flyers, petitions, solicit donations or things like that within a 100-foot radius of the polling place doors, right?
Okay.
Outside of that radius, you know, do what you got to do. You can have your pamphlets, you can have your bumpers, stickers, things like that. But if you cross that threshold, then an election inspector has the right to ask you to step back or take a beat. That's why there's also regulations on people entering into polling places wearing their memorabilia, you know, their pins, their hats, their shirts, or bringing in pamphlets, because that's also considered a form of canvassing. So when that kind of canvassing happens, right, an election inspector is then permitted to say, excuse me, you know, unfortunately, that's a form of canvassing. We're going to need you to go to the restroom, turn your shirt inside out. We need you to remove your hat, remove your button, what have you. And then you can come back in here and we can check you in and give you your ballot accordingly. Usually that should go down without any kind of hitch, and people are pretty understanding of that. Material in your hand, yeah, it really frowned upon, but if you need it to help you vote, you know, usually it's permitted, but there's more nuance to it. We can get into it another time.
Sure. So, and you know, the concern that we always see is you know, people, you know, on the sidelines holding the sign, and you know, that's fine, right? I have
Yeah,
no issue with it. You know, again, you know, First Amendment concept is, you know, you
absolutely.
get to say your position, someone else gets to sit right next to you and
Absolutely.
state their position, right? That's the entire point of the First Amendment, right?
Yep,
So,
absolutely.
you know, I totally understand, you know, that kind of issue that's there, and when we're dealing with the 100-foot radius, do you think that most hosts of election or voting precincts, excuse me, have a really good and accurate idea of, you know, where 100 feet is, right? You talk to the average person, they may not know, you know, exactly where 100 feet is. So would you advise, you know, actually going out and making sure, you know, pollsters and everyone who is going to be, you know, kind of overseeing this election has a really good understanding of where we're measuring that location from?
Absolutely. And that's part of the training, right? And the planning and the preparation. You'll see that most inspectors are provided with like maps of the polling place, right? The precinct, so that they know where everything is supposed to go. There is so much detail and nuance that goes
Mhm.
into planning and preparation for a successful election day, that is just one small piece. But absolutely, usually folks will earmark it. They'll notify law enforcement where that line is. So when they do their regular drive-bys, they know where that line is too, to enforce it. And I will say most regular canvassers, most folks who dedicate their election day to doing this know too, and won't give you any problems if you ask them to step back.
Okay, great. And you know, look, we've gotten you know, several questions here already. You know, some
Okay.
public and some have come over privately here.
Mhm.
We're not going to have time to answer them all, but one thing that I do want to say is, you know, anyone that does not get their question answered, please reach out to us. You know, we're happy to chat. Actually, let me rephrase that. Please reach out to Courtney. I'm a corporate attorney. You do not want me answering this question. But we'll be happy to get those answers if we can't get to them during this coffee break here. That being said, you brought up an interesting point, which is, you know, someone's wearing a t-shirt or a button or something like that, right? Go in the restroom, turn
Mhm.
the shirt inside out, remove the button,
Yep,
whatever it is, right? And you
yep,
mentioned that most people comply. And look, again, I have a very benign precinct. I've seen it happen, right? No
mhm.
problem, right? But what happens if they don't comply, right? Are there any generalized rule? I know, again, very case specific, you
Yeah,
know, it's hard to give concrete advice because, you know, these things exist on a spectrum, right?
yeah.
But what is the general, you know, overview or advice or issue that you see if someone won't comply?
Well, if they won't comply, unfortunately, that's when you get law enforcement involved. And when you continue to push that envelope, there are certain laws and regulations, most of them misdemeanors, right? If somebody doesn't comply and they will not leave the polling place. So
Mhm.
you really want to be mindful as an elector when you're walking into your precinct, what you can and cannot do. And if you don't know, then ask. The election inspectors are trained, they should know, right? If you do everything right, the ins and outs of what is and is not permitted. So ask, and they will let you know. Usually they'll have somebody at the door also, who's volunteering, giving some kind of guidance and whatnot. But again, if you push that envelope, you could be looking at a misdemeanor.
Okay, got it. So I'd like to move on because we only have about 15 minutes left here, right? We've heard the term election challenger a lot lately, right? I know that there's a couple categories of election workers that you've mentioned beforehand. You have the people voting, you have the pollster or the poll worker, excuse me.
Yeah.
So can you kind of give me a understanding of who's going to be there, what an election challenger is, and what is the difference between an election challenger and maybe some of the other titles that we've seen associated with voting in the past?
Yeah, so an election inspector, I'll start there just because I've said it a couple of different times now. They're your poll workers. They're the ones who are paid and trained and hired by the local government hosting the election to make sure everything goes down without a hitch. They're the ones who check you in the beginning of the day or whenever you come in to get your ballot. They're the ones who make sure that there are no glitches with the machinery. And they're the ones who break everything down, make sure all the tapes and ballots and all those figures line up. And then they're the ones who make sure that everything gets over to your appropriate designated receiving board, right? Yeah. So those are your frontline workers. Those are the ones who are trained by your local clerk to make sure that everything goes down without a hitch. And the good thing about election inspectors is that usually at minimum, there has to be 3 election inspectors per precinct. Two of those election inspectors have to be from different political, I can't say parties officially because they don't have to be registered in a specific party, but they have to be they have to have 2 different political preferences from the majority parties, right? So a Republican and a Democrat traditionally, and they have to do everything together. It's a real buddy system. So if you have a question, you're going to get 2 election inspectors there to assist you. If there's a glitch with the machine, they're going to be the ones taking care of that. So they have a real key instrumental role in ensuring that elections go down without any issues. Then when you get into election challengers, that's totally different because they're non-governmental employees. They're not paid, right? They're there at the will of the political party that asked them to represent them, right? And they typically get credentials and there's certain criteria that they have to meet. But basically, once you get credentialed as an election challenger, you can show up to the precincts and you can observe everything, right? And you have to do so at the discretion of the election inspector, right? You can't just kind of
interfere.
Yeah, you can't interfere. You can't touch the machines. You can't go touching anybody's ballots and stuff. Usually, if you're doing things right, there should be a designated challenge. I don't know why my brain is skipping a beat here, but there should be a designated challenger liaison essentially from the election inspectors there, right, to field those election challengers who are present. And they're going to go around and they're going to keep a close eye on everything. This is part of that strict scrutiny we were talking about, right? Keeping an eye on everything. And if they see something they don't like, they can pose a challenge, and that's really intimidating for folks who aren't familiar or who aren't trained properly. An election challenger can challenge on eligibility of a voter, right? And that's not about background, right? That has nothing to do with race, nationality, religion, or anything like that. It has to do with their eligibility as a voter. Sure. So are they a US citizen? Are they registered in that precinct? Are they of the right age? Things like that, right? Very narrow scope. If they make a challenge like that, then the challenger liaison gets involved and determines whether it's a permissible challenge or an acceptable one. And there's a whole process for that. The only time a challenge in that sense will be rejected is if it's inappropriate, like I said, religious based or something like that. Something
protected class, right?
A protected class, and that's exactly it. And then they can also challenge like the election workers themselves, right? So if they don't like what they're seeing from the election inspectors, if they don't think that the polling place is being managed appropriately, then they can pose a challenge, which then has to be reviewed and assessed. And the same thing like before, they can accept, reject, mark it as like permissible, but rejecting anyway, right? So there's a whole process there. So there's a lot of weight with election challengers. And I will say from my experience, election challengers are the wild card at a precincts, right? Because you never know if you're going to get somebody who's really familiar with the process and is going to be on top of everything, nickel and diming everything, or if you're going to get somebody who's pretty laid back. But again, going back to what you said earlier, which I really like, communication is key at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So when an election challenger walks in, immediately have your election or challenger or liaison meet up with them and discuss, do's and don'ts at their polling place.
Yeah.
And I'll just talk about this briefly, poll workers, totally different ballgame as well. Not an election challenger. They don't have that same credentialing. They don't have that same authority. They're basically volunteers and their only job is to watch. They don't have this discretion to challenge. You can regulate where they stand and they're just there observing. So if somebody comes in and they try to say they're an election challenger, make sure you look for their credentials first. Because chances are they're probably more so a poll watcher, and you can tell them to kind of step back and observe. And please note that if at any point a challenger or a poll watcher stops listening to the election inspectors, if they make any of the same violations we already talked about, you can ask them to leave, right? So that's gonna be case by case, but you do have that kind of discretion there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and look, this all comes down to confidence in the election process,
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
I don't care what side of the political spectrum you're on. I
Mhm.
think everyone can agree that we want, true and accurate, polls and votes, right? How we get there, yeah, there may be some divergent concepts on that,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
But again, having confidence in the process is really the foundation of our political system.
It
So,
is, yeah.
tempering, some of the emotional issues that sometimes, come with elections, right? Whether it's this election, 5, 10 years ago. I mean, you can go back to any point in time. There's always been contentious elections, right? Having a good process, having it communicated clearly would probably behoove everyone in making sure that there's that confidence, in the end result of the election. So, we've got 8 minutes left. I got a couple more questions for you. Yeah, I
Yeah,
know we
please.
can talk about this one for hours, right? And again, I do know I've gotten probably a dozen or so questions here. We're not
Oh,
going to get
great. Keep them
time to
coming, guys.
so again, I do hope that anyone that does not have their questions answered, please reach out to Courtney, right? Just unfortunately, there isn't enough time to get into everyone's questions here. So in the months leading up to election, we see a lot of lawn signs, a lot of, candidate signs, marketing materials, or even, unfortunately, there's just some bad people in the world, we'll say that, have just bad signs, right? Offensive signs, things like
Mhm.
that, right? Is there a duality as far as what is permissible within the 100 feet? If you happen to have a home within 100 feet of the polling location
Yeah,
versus outside of the polling location, and then just generally speaking, what's allowed, right? And again, I know that your answer is likely going to be it depends on the actual sign, right? We're not going to be able to get into the nitty gritty and
yeah.
talk about any specifics on this call, but from a high level overview, can you tell us a little bit about what's allowed, what isn't allowed, and where people need to have some concerns or be watching?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's such a broad question because, sign regulations and ordinances in each community vary, right? About
Mhm.
what's allowed and what's not allowed and how they police those ordinances. And then you add in that polling aspect, right? And most of our polling precincts are located in schools or they're located in
Mhm.
churches. So you've got homes in very close proximity. And you can kind of like almost like get up to that line, right, of like what's appropriate and what's not appropriate for signage in those properties. But like you said, it's that 100-foot radius, right? As long as it's not within that 100-foot radius, unfortunately, kind of everything goes. Even if you have what's considered a profane, I'm not gonna say profane. If you have a sign with profanity on it, right, sitting in somebody's yard, I think we've all
Mhm.
seen them, unfortunately. And even if it makes us uncomfortable, that profanity is First Amendment protected language. And you can't ask that person to take it down. You've got to just I've said it before, but roll with it, unfortunately. So I could talk about sign regulations all day and content neutral and things like that, but for the purpose of what we're here to talk about, I would just say when it comes to canvassing, whether it's somebody physically on the premises at a polling place or if it's somebody on their personal property, you got to tread carefully.
Yeah. So, actually, a question just popped up that I was going to ask. So,
Okay.
when we start talking about that 100-foot radius, right? Because that seems to be a key for a lot of
It
these
is.
answers,
It
right?
really is. Yeah.
What you can do, what you can't do it, right? Just generally speaking, how do you measure, right? Is it from the corner of the building? Is it from the entrance? Is it from the center? Is it from, the actual voting booth, right? There's a hundred different ways that you can measure a distance,
Mhm.
right? Generally speaking, do you know what the rule is and how logistically we measure those? And again, understanding every building is different, so there
Yeah.
might be some nuances here, right, that are out
Yeah.
there. But generally speaking, what's the generalized rule?
I've always seen it from the entrance of the door, the main door leading into the precinct. We're
Yeah,
not talking about back doors, right, or alley entrances or anything like that. We're talking about the main doors, and there will be signage, right, to let you know what those doors are. So people aren't just kind of coming in willy-nilly. So you'll know what doors they are, and there usually is some kind of like, I've seen it where they do like little stakes or little chalking or something like that to let folks know. And if you're somebody who's, really adamant about making sure that it's 100 feet to the dot, I've seen challenges there, but that's really unlikely. As long as you're transparent about how you're measuring, which is usually from the door, you should be fine.
okay, got it. Now, we only have 4 minutes left. So, what
Okay,
are
okay.
some things that an election law attorney or a municipal law attorney can assist with on the day of, right? And I know we have a lot of townships here. We may represent some of them, we may not represent others, right? So, what are some things that poll workers or clerks or whoever the relevant stakeholders are? What are some things that they may be able to reach out to their counsel on the day of election to deal with, any issues that may pop up?
I really like that question because I think that from my perspective and my experiences, right, and I've been doing municipal law for almost 10 years and election law for much longer. And I would just say that, well, first and foremost, to me, clerks are the hardest working folks in local government. And I think that they've got such a challenging job, especially right now in this political climate. And for a municipal attorney or an election law attorney to be a true asset to that clerk, our job would start way before actual election day, right? Like we should be right up there in the trenches with our clerks, assisting them as questions arise, because there will be, right? As you're troubleshooting and training, you're going to be coming up with different scenarios and things like that. And you're going to want to bounce it off of somebody. So I think that's a big part of what election and municipal law attorneys do is we troubleshoot and try to make sure we're identifying those issues before they come up so we can plan accordingly. But when it comes to the day of, I think just being accessible, I think most attorneys will give their clerks their phone number, reach out to us if you have a question about a challenge that comes up, reach out to us if you have a question about somebody violating the photo rule, things like that. If you're just not sure and you don't want to take the plunge in making a determination, I would normally say, give us a ring. That's what we're here for.
Yeah,
Even at the end of the night, when you're going through the ballots and making sure everything is sealed appropriately, we get tons of questions about whether or not, the ballots are properly sealed and whether things have been tracked appropriately. And then I'll also say after election day, I think that's when our jobs really kick in, right? Because you're going to be getting FOIA requests, you're going to get recount petitions. So really, when you're a clerk and when you're a municipal law attorney, you're working hand in hand, not just for the day of, but really for months before and weeks to months afterward.
yeah.
It's pretty collaborative.
Well, and again, it keeps getting back down to that have a good plan for communication, right?
Yes,
We see this
absolutely.
on the corporate side all the time, right? Something goes wrong. Hey, here's the process, right?
Mhm.
First you call this person. If they don't have a good answer, there's not confidence in the answer, then you call this person, right?
Mhm.
Having a flow for how problems are dealt with ahead of time, right?
Yes.
That everyone knows, that everyone buys into, I think will at least ease the burden of problems and challenges and resolutions, right? Rather than trying to figure out the process on the fly, right?
Yeah.
And I have to believe, I mean, look, we've been doing elections for, more than a dozen years here, right? And we're talking about
Mhm.
hundreds of years of elections, right? And while technology changes, while laws changes, while, rules, regulations, locations, and things like that change, there's a process, right? And we have to respect that process, and having a good communication plan, I
Yeah.
think, is probably one of the most important things. Again, just look at it from the corporate side, right? Knowing when to reach out, knowing
Yeah.
how to deal with problems, and having that flow chart is probably one of the biggest bangs for a buck that a
Absolutely. I
company can
agree.
do. I have to believe that it applies equally in this instance. So
Mhm.
got
I
it.
agree.
So well, Courtney, we are on time. In fact, we're a little over here. Again, I want to thank you for being here today. This is such a timely topic. It's a topic that everyone has a vested interest, or at minimum a vested interest, but probably more than just a passing interest in. We're very political nowadays, right? And having a good understanding of the system will help bring confidence, to that system, or will help facilitate appropriate challenges to
Mhm.
that system. So, again, with the speed of communications, Twitter and things like that, and let's be honest, everyone on social media has an internet law degree, right? Having some really good understanding of the nuances of the law and the process, I think, is paramount to having that confidence. Again, communication, communication, communication.
Yep.
So I want to thank you again for taking time out of your day to be here. Again, to anyone who's on this call, I know I've said it twice. I'm going to say it a third time. If we did not get your question, please feel free to reach out to Courtney. A lot of the questions that I've seen, both publicly and privately, are very specific, right? And there may be certain nuances that need to be discussed in order to give, some high level analysis. So, Courtney's information is posted in the chat window, and is also available online. I'd like to invite everyone to attend our next Wednesday coffee break session, where we're going to be talking again about a semi-municipal thing, about some of the new firearm laws that are out there, some of the red flag laws, some of the safe storage laws, and things like that. And instead of hosting, ironically, I may be a one of the interviewees, so it'll be a little role reversal for me here. But we're going to talk about those new firearm laws. We're going to talk about what some of the implications are, both in the public sector as well as the private sector, right? What employers can do and things like that, some of the best practices, and also making sure that anyone who's a stakeholder in the firearms industry, as a manufacturer, retailer, or anything like that, has some at least some guidance as to what these new laws are. So again, thank you all for attending today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Have a fantastic week. Take care.